Hi, so hello everybody. Welcome to this discussion on a really increasingly important topic, which is online harassment and various kinds of threats, intimidation, abuse, uncivil behavior that seems to be coming at journalists from all angles. I know there have been other sessions today on this topic, and so we may cover some similar ground, but it's such an important topic. I'm really glad that the festival is giving it lots of coverage. First of all, I'm going to introduce the panel, and then we'll kind of try and make this as an open discussion as possible. So I'll take questions at various times. My name is Gavin Rees, and I work for the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma. And we're an organisation that's like a network of concerned professionals, journalists, psychologists, and trauma experts who are interested in understanding how we can make better, more insightful and accurate and interesting and relevant reporting on violence. And sometimes we're talking to people about issues around interviewing, other times we're talking about self-care, and we're also talking about how we engage with audiences. If you may have seen this is a kind of freebie to take away. It's a guide on how to handle traumatic imagery that comes into the newsroom. I'm giving it to you now precisely because we haven't really got time to talk about this as a subtopic, so you can go away and read that. So let me introduce my panel. On my left, I have Greg Barber, who's head of digital news at the Washington Post, and has been working on a very exciting project, the Coral Project, which is looking at issues of the kind of new rules and procedures for audience engagement in this shifting online world that we don't really understand very well yet. And on my right is Michelle Ferrier, who is the founder. I'm almost inclined to say that she's kind of Buffy the Vampire Slayer of the online media world, because the organization she runs is called Troll Busters. And as part of this conversation, we're going to have a little kind of, I don't know what the word would be, ethological, like a kind of wildlife program discussion of the various habits of trolls and what they do and what they're like and how we can confront them. She's also an associate professor at Scripps College of Journalism, is that right?
Scripps School of Journalism.
Scripps School of Journalism, I'm corrected, at Ohio University. And at the end of the table, we have Barbara Hans, who's editor-in-chief of Spiegel Online, and a long-time friend and associate of the Dart Centre. I think we met in about 2010 when you came and did an academic fellowship. Barbara's very interested in student engagement as well, and had designed a really interesting trauma and journalism course for students. So, online harassment. The days used to be that we saw ourselves, I don't know what the word would be, but kind of hard-boiled and hard-bitten. And the idea was that if people in the public sent in threatening letters, then they were just kind of isolated cranks, and water should flow off a duck's back, and sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt, etc., etc., etc. But we seem to have gone through a game change now, when the abuse is coming from all directions. Some of it's mechanized, some of it's organized by states. Other uncivility appears to be springing up naturally in the ether. We were hoping for an age of engagement online, and instead we seem to be confronted with an age of anger. So before we go into a kind of more of a conversation mode, I'm going to ask Michelle to just give us a kind of sort of brief where we are now type picture.
Sure. I wanted to share a little bit about what we look at, particularly in the U.S., around online harassment, and hope that some of this might translate as well to the experiences that I've heard from other journalists from around the world as I've been working on this issue for the past few years. And so I wanted to define this term, particularly in the literature and the scholarship that looks at online harassment. It's an intentional and overt act of aggression. which involves making rude or nasty comments, etc. And that's important for the literature, but that doesn't really define how this operates when it comes into the legal environment. So I think there's some differences in how we look at it as scholars and how it's operationalized when we come to creating solutions around this space. To describe a little bit about what we've been seeing over the past several years in this space, in the US particularly, the Pew Research Center, who does research work on media and the populace, found that 4 in 10 users in general are experiencing online harassment in these days, and that this harassment has become more severe. And this was a study done in 2014, and I'm sure if the results were done today, we'd find a very different result. Specifically on Twitter, which is the platform that I primarily work on, we have a study that was done that looked at the many faces of hate speech and harassment on Twitter. And you can see at the top, while there's a prevalence of hate speech, we see other activities that are also happening on this platform that are racist, homophobic, that are putting out personal information of women and journalists in this space in a way that intimidates and provides an environment of fear. The International News Safety Institute has also done some work, particularly looking at both the physical as well as the online presence of harassment. And they discovered that journalists themselves feel that their work is much more dangerous than it has been in the past, and primarily pointing to the role of social media and the ways in which they've used that in their work. I think you might be familiar with the example of this journalist here who was here in Italy and was trying to put out some very innocuous information, I believe, about putting a woman on the money in the country, and received some threats from other places on the right here, and then some other threats that we see. So while some of the harassment is about personal appearance, what people are wearing, etc., we have a gamut and a spectrum of speech that we're seeing online that goes from insults to explicit threats. Death threats, rape threats, people being sent videos of beheadings on back channels, etc., all designed to target women journalists, and particularly journalists of color, from having their voice heard in the media. Online news publishers in the United States, we have hyperlocal online news sites, as I know others have developed around the world. And so this is not a phenomenon of just large legacy media organizations. These independent organizations also deal with these types of threats, and it makes a difference in their ability to be able to do their work. I wanted to just point out that this is not the mythology of the teen boy in a basement that has nothing else better to do that has an issue. What we're talking about are smart mobs, large groups, whether they're organized through gaming networks like Gamergate, political operatives, government officials, presidents of countries that are engaging in the kind of hate speech and targeting of journalists that put them in danger in the work that they do on a daily basis. I think it's important for us to understand as we talk about this issue that there's a couple of challenges that we face. Our professional culture prevents us in a lot of ways, as Gavin indicated earlier, from really talking about this issue in our own newspapers. In the United States, with the recent election, when some of our newspapers changed their allegiances, their political allegiances, and endorsed candidates of the opposite political party, their journalists were threatened with death. And it was the first time that I'd seen newspapers actually call out harassment in their newspapers to their readers. In a very powerful way, showing that they were in solidarity with each other. So I think we need to understand that there's a nuanced way in which we need to begin to talk about this conversation, and the types of threats and how we might be able to respond to them are very different depending on these threats. Not only do we see that this is an individual issue, where the emotional state of the journalist, the ability of the journalist to be able to do his or her work, the self-censorship that goes on, internally as well as externally, as women journalists grapple with this issue, makes it challenging for us to do our work as a news enterprise. We find that there are issues and topics that are just not covered, or people are unwilling to cover because they know they're going to draw the ire of online hate groups. And so to open our discussion, I wanted to give that background and help you understand that what we're dealing with is not only the individual impact on journalists themselves, but on the news enterprise and our ability to be able to speak truth to power and be the force of change in our communities.
Great, thank you. So that's a disturbing idea, that what seems to be effectively happening is that the well is being poisoned. The important sense of meaning which drives journalism forward and particularly makes us want to kind of take on the most challenging stories seems to be poisoned by the very people that we're supposed to be serving. So in other words, if our models are moving towards engagement and towards reaching out to our audiences, it appears that sections of our audiences are biting back in a way that's poisoning that enterprise. So Greg, you've been thinking about this. Yep. What's going on?
Fix it, right? Yeah. So it's a challenge. I mean, and certainly, the kinds of harassment that journalists see on social media, it ranges from bothersome to truly traumatic. And I think that there are different layers of ways that we can approach it. Number one, I think, as Michelle says, news organizations need to be cognizant of the potential for harm to their staff in interacting in social spaces. But there are also things that news organizations can do when it comes to their own space and the interactions that journalists have there. And that's some of the work that we're doing in a group that I'm part of called the Coral Project. The Coral Project's a collaboration between the Washington Post, where I work, the New York Times, and Mozilla, the creators of Firefox. We're funded by a grant from the Knight Foundation in the United States. And our goal is to create open source software and renewed best practices that give news organizations the tools they need to be able to manage conversations on their sites. And to one side of it, of course, as a content side, making sure that those conversations are interesting and are civil and are compelling, and that help the news organization in their storytelling and help readers to better understand what real people think about the news. But what they can also do, this software that we've created, what it can also do is help news organizations to ensure that when their journalists participate in conversation spaces on their own site, in the spaces that they can control, that harassment, that threatening behavior is not allowed, that it's not something that their staff has to deal with while they're doing this work. Part of how we're doing that is by keeping track, basically simple math, keeping track of the ways that moderation interacts with users. So let's say that you have a user who's had more than 60% of their comments deleted, right? That's likely a problem user. So that gives the news organization, knowing this information, the ability to either reach out to this user and try to see if they can change their behavior, or cycle this user off and say, okay, maybe you shouldn't have access to our conversation space anymore. But the biggest thrust of what we're aiming to incentivize news organizations to do is to think about the kinds of positive contributions that can come in, to help news organizations find where their best contributors are, and then to be able to spend the time that we spend with those contributors, the ones who come in with stories that are interesting, with information that adds layers of color and texture to the types of stories that we're trying to tell, to the sorts of people who can bring in a new and different perspective, so that the storytelling that we have is more diverse and more layered. And helps to sort of move us forward in our understanding about the communities that we cover. So that's the kind of work that we're doing at the Coral Project to help news organizations to manage the spaces that they themselves control. And my hope is that that social media, so Facebook, Twitter, the kinds of places that especially Twitter that Michelle's been studying, could institute similar tools so that participating in those spaces is not as risky as it is right now for journalists, particularly women and journalists of color.
Right. So what I hear there partly is that we're trying to sow the ground for a kind of better kind of audience.
That's right.
So we want to attract kind of wizards, elves, and hobbits rather than trolls. But we still have like a kind of big troll problem. You saw, you've seen pictures of horrific trolls in kind of cartoons. And these kind of monsters of our imagination who hog the discussion, what is their impact on the Spiegel Online and who takes a hit? Which journalists are most beset by this problem?
Well, it's hard to say that, basically, because everyone who's writing on the webpage is confronted with those trolls, no matter whether you report on politics or economics or on social issues. And if you have a foreign-sounding name, it gets certainly worse. If you're a woman, it's interrelated with sexism and all of that. But certainly those people working in the social media department are confronted with it even more heavily, or the colleagues who are managing our comments section, of course. But then still, every one of us who's writing articles is being confronted with this special sort of hatred and sexism, and every colleague can really tell you a story about that.
And what kind of impact does it have on the newsroom in terms of how
Well, on the one hand, you'll find cynicism, because in the beginning we all had this idea of the democratization of communication through the internet and an open dialogue and all of that. And we certainly know that as a mass medium, we are confronted with all sorts of communication. By far, not all of it is constructive. And not everyone who's shouting at us is really intending on having a dialogue, which we thought and assumed a couple of years ago, that it is up to us to foster a sort of dialogue with the audience. But not everyone who's coming around shouting at us is really intending on having a dialogue with us. So there is a topic of cynicism, and there is a way of talking about it in the newsroom, and we certainly do have colleagues who tell you, look, after that comment, which I wrote in the refugee crisis, for example, on the topics, I stopped commenting articles. I no longer want to write my name on top of articles because of that harassment, and I can understand that, really. If your email account is overflowing with hate emails and all of that, and people tell you that you should be raped, you should be killed, you shouldn't do your job, whatever, I can personally understand that one is quite reluctant to like one's job, really.
Okay, so if I was a journalist working for you and I'd gone through a long period of receiving maybe death threats or really abusive material, and I came to you, what would you tell me?
First of all, it's good that you came, really. I mean, I think the first thing we can do, and we certainly have to do, is talking about it. And it's no longer the point of this alpha journalists who can cope with everything by themselves, but about talking about it with your colleagues. And to me, trolls have a lot to do with your way of perceiving what you're doing, and you need a lot of reassurance about your work and about that what you've written has been right, and that it's basically that it's not your fault, but the fault of the people who are attacking you, and that needs a network within the newsroom to speak openly about it, and to have senior editors speaking up about it, really, that it's no longer taboo. Because if we make it a taboo, the trolls really have won. That's what they want.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the things that we know about people when they're threatened or in threatening situations is there's a tendency to focus on the threat. And so the threat grows bigger and bigger. It almost sort of kind of magically becomes the center of attention. And that has, kind of understandable survival reasons. So if you're in a situation where somebody points a gun at your face, the thing you're likely to concentrate on is the gun. So we call that weapon fixation, a kind of a narrowing of focus and attention. And if we're dealing with kind of imagined threats and imagined fears, they can be very, very isolating, because I think is what Barbara's saying is this idea that we should be equal to the threat, we should be robust, and therefore there's a concern people often have in expressing their feelings, and finding solidarity. So everybody who works in the trauma world, be it people who are emergency workers or ambulance workers, or they're soldiers on the battlefield, the one thing that they know is very important for resilience is social support, connection, feeling part of a team, feeling that you're being taken seriously, feeling that you're doing the right thing and that your job matters. And so one of the issues here, I think, is fragmentation and isolation and people not being connected. So Michelle, if I'm not putting words in your mouth, if I suggest that's part of where Trollbusters comes from as an organization that tries to connect people.
In some ways, I think what we really are trying to do is offer that lifeline at the moment of attack, to be able to really support women journalists in persisting online in the face of these kinds of attacks. And really, the idea for Trollbusters comes from some of my own experience as a columnist. I worked at a newspaper in Florida for several years as a columnist and night news editor, and received hate mail through the postal system. This was over 12 years ago that I was doing this work. And the tactics, obviously, social media wasn't as prevalent, wasn't being used, but the tactics that we're seeing today are the same tactics that were used back then. Letter writing campaigns, et cetera, to try and put fear and intimidation into the reporters. This is just a piece of one of the letters that I received. These are manifestos. And they constantly use similar kinds of language. And so as I began to investigate my own case, as the letters continued, I started disguising myself and wearing wigs. I carried a gun, and I began to drive different ways to work to try and avoid what was happening. When I went to the police, they would patrol my house every time a letter came, but there really was no investigation that was going on into this. And as I began to look at this, I began to recognize the rise of white supremacist groups in the United States and try and call attention to the journalists 10 years ago that this was a rising problem and that it was surfacing and we needed to pay attention to it. At the time, I received not a lot of support from my organization. They suggested that I take a colleague to my car with me when I was going home in the evenings, as if I was going to push them in front of the bullet, instead of sacrificing myself. And so I've had an opportunity to really dive back into that experience, and had the opportunity 2 years ago to really think about, as Gamergate was happening in the US, it triggered for me the memories of what had happened to me over 12 years ago. I had originally, when this happened over 10 years ago, tried to start a project called Spot Hate, which was geotagging hate crime activity across the US and mapping that against the Southern Poverty Law Center's database of known white supremacist groups and Nazi groups operating in the US. And at the time, the Southern Poverty Law Center did not have their database in a digitized format to be able to really make that a robust way of looking at the dynamics of what was happening in the US. And so 12 years later, when Gamergate was happening, I was triggered by that and said, we've got to come up with a solution for this. This is still happening. And so Trollbusters was born at a hackathon with women journalists. It was created with a team of international women who came together and said, what do we need to support ourselves online? Because as I showed statistically, while women and men both get trolled, women get trolled more severely, more often, and it is irregardless of the content of the things that they write about. And so I wrote a lifestyle column that talked about my kids and teaching them how to ride a bicycle. This was not political commentary. And yet I was still attacked, and we see that it is not content related, but identity related when it comes to women and journalists of color operating in this space. And now we see it has grown to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and other different types of issues and groups that have also been impacted by this work. So Trollbusters offers just-in-time support to women. If they notify us, we jump into their feed. And as Gavin said, there's an isolating effect. It's almost like a wolf pack, especially when you're talking about the kind of smart mob and swarm activity that journalists particularly are victims of. There's an isolating feeling because you can't talk to your colleagues because then you're seen as weak and may not get the story assignments that you'd like to have in the future. And you can't explain to your family what's happening. And so you become isolated and unwilling to put yourself out online or offline. I stopped going to events that I was supposed to do as a public person because I was afraid of who was going to show up in the room. So we support women by providing positive messaging, letting them know that we're there on the site, pointing them to technical, legal, and psychological resources that they may be able to find in the moment, and really helping to support them in much more of a reactive way. And over the past year, we've been trying to be much more proactive in the work that we do, using some monitoring tools to be able to track women journalists who have agreed to allow us to track their feeds, and being able to proactively jump into their feeds when we see content that is inappropriate and point that out to the trolls, to let them know somebody's watching, and oftentimes that may diminish or slow the speed of the types of attacks that we see. We also feel that a lot of what might be solved can be done through some preventive measures that journalists themselves might engage in, such as not only protecting your identity online in some very clear ways, but also protecting your sources as well, who oftentimes are secondary targets of the trolls that are coming after journalists. And we don't think about that in our work, but they very often are. And then, as you all have had on your chair there, we've recently created, based on that speech threat wheel that I showed earlier, an exploded version of that into this infographic, because we realized that people just don't know what to do when they have a specific kind of threat. And so this flow chart helps people understand, where do I go? And this is very US-based, but I'm hoping to work with colleagues like you across the world who are interested in translating this vehicle into something that might work in your country. So I'm hoping that we might find partners to be able to do that as well. And so we do push out content on Twitter and social media to let people know that we're available, and also to provide that just-in-time education, as I said, so people can lock down their physical location, because this activity does migrate offline. We can't think this is just a virtual thing, and if we throw our hands up and get off of the internet, that this is going to be solved. This activity manifests itself in physical attack as well as other kinds of technical attacks on websites, etc. So I think vigilance is what's called for, and preventive measures, as well as awareness and action from a variety of entities.
If I might, Gavin.
Yeah, please, come in.
News organizations, I mean, the kinds of problems you outlined, news organizations can't solve all of those, but we can chip away at the problem. And so things that news organizations can do, we have some power here, we can help. So making sure that, I would say to anyone in this room who cares about this issue, raise it with your editors, raise it with your bosses, with your publisher. News organizations can provide training and support, right? Every news organization has a group that is the set of social media experts. Well, one of the things that we could become expert in is how to manage this kind of behavior when it starts, especially if one of the things we're asking of our journalists is to participate in social media. When it comes to the kinds of interactions that happen on our space, we can manage that. So every news organization should have a set of rules, should have a discussion policy, and should enforce it. There is no requirement that each news organization, Barbara, the kind of experience you were talking about in comments, every news organization should be able to manage that. If you have comments somewhere, don't allow this. Tell your readers this is what's allowed and this is what isn't, and have a moderation regime that manages that. And we also have the tool of reporting. You mentioned, Michelle, that when things got particularly bad around the election, news organizations actually took notice and actually reported about it. When our journalists are in physical danger in other parts of the world, as they are when they're being threatened, we report on it. And we say, this is a situation where our journalists are in danger, and that's part of the story. This is also part of the story. Reporting is a tool that is also in our toolbox. What we need to say as news organizations is this is not something we will stand for. Our reporters, people who work at news organizations, they are our employees, and we will protect them. We will use the tools at our disposal to do that. And so I think if we stand together, that's a way that we can manage that. And all of us in this room have the opportunity within our organizations to make a case for that, and I think we should.
Also thinking that maybe there are particular pinch points in the organization. So for instance, we tend to think it's the journalists who write the pieces who are the subjects of attacks. But in lots of news organizations, there's a whole back team of moderators and sifters. And they're not just handling one or two journalist stories, they're handling a whole group of journalist stories. And so I'm interested in what happens when there's a kind of, in Germany, for instance, there's this whole idea of the Lügenpresse, and these people swarm together. How do you allow people to comment on all your stories? How do you handle that?
No, we don't allow them to comment on all of our stories just because we can't handle it. Right. If we still believe that there should be a certain level of debate, we can't open it up everywhere just because we know that there are topics where any sort of constructive debate is undermined within seconds after opening up the forum. So we decided on choosing on what topics we allow people to debate on. And that has been criticized heavily because whilst we were reporting on refugees, those forums have been massively trolled. So we decided not to allow people to comment on those stories, and we explained why we did that, right, and made it transparent to people that there was not any sort of constructive debate possible, because we have around 60,000 people who have registered for our comment section, and we only have a handful of people who work on that, and it's still not feasible, really. But yeah, the critique we get is that that this would be censorship, and I tend to say that it's not a common right to comment on all the topics you want to. Like, that's nothing to do with open debate and open speech. There's no human right that you have to comment on all topics that we write about at Spiegel Online. But yeah, I see the point, and that's a lot to do with open speech on the internet, really. And then it's our responsibility, even legally, to control what is going on there. And it's like, if you have your house and your little garden in front of it, you want to know what's going on there, right? And we don't want these areas to be areas where we don't shed light on. The opposite is
so it's like inviting somebody into your house. It's not like a public bar when you're publishing stuff.
Yeah. Well, and there's plenty of internet out there for everybody, right? So you can find a space to say whatever it is you want to say, and more power to you. But in your space, in our space, we have the ability to say this is what we want to do. One of the projects that one of the approaches we've taken at the Coral Project is actually to come at this particular issue. So in a lot of cases, comments perhaps are not the right way to engage with readers, right? Especially in a space where, or on a topic where there's a lot of controversy, and where perhaps that topic could get overrun by people who are trying to sort of flood the zone and not allow a real debate to go on. So one of the products we've created at the Coral Project is called Ask, and it's a form builder. And so what you can do is create a form and ask questions. And then readers submit their responses, and then the journalists can look at those responses, see which responses are best, and then publish those out for all readers to see. What we found is that when you change the tool that you're using, depending on the kind of conversation you want to curate, readers get a different idea of what the manner of engagement should be. So when we've used at the Washington Post forms, what we tend to get are conversations that aren't quite as quick, right, as comments. They don't involve as much sort of building on conversation because they're flat, right? It's just a user sending in information. However, what we also see is that where comments will get you those sort of short staccato bursts of readers interacting with each other, which can be quite helpful on certain types of stories. Forms will get you sort of more of a lean-back experience for the reader, where the reader will instead send something that is oftentimes much more layered, much more personal, and where you can and where you can get that kind of public feedback that you want without subjecting your articles, your readers, your staff to the kinds of things that can happen when you have open comments. We just did this on the Washington Post with a story about American healthcare because at the time it looked like it may change. Now it looks like it may change again. Who's to say? So we asked users, if healthcare changed, what would happen to you? What would be the impact on you? And this was the type of story, right, where if we had left comments open, our users would talk about the president and whether they liked him or didn't, or all that sort of thing, and it would devolve into a fist fight. What we ended up getting were these wonderfully personal stories, these sort of deeply personal stories from people. And so the reporter who set up the forum reached out to some of the people who responded. By the way, almost 1,200 people responded, which was terrific. She reached out to about 5 of those people who responded, wrote a story did some reporting, talking to them, wrote a story based on their responses, and then wrote a second story just giving a taste of the kinds of things that we got through the forum. So one forum that took about 10 minutes to set up, and she was able to get 2 stories out of it, was able to get that kind of added texture that you can get when you have lots of your readers contribute, but without having the kind of experience that you described where it's just kind of a mess.
Yeah, great. One thing that is kind of quite dear to the heart of the Dart Centre is we do a lot of support for people reporting on stories about child abuse, sexual violence, torture, these very, very big stories. It's really important to turn off commenting on those kinds of stories when you have a lot of first-person accounts. So if you have a woman who's describing the experience of domestic abuse and then she's trolled as a result of that account, or the below-the-line comments are full of people saying things like, "You bitch, you fucking deserved it, what did you expect?" That's extremely psychologically undermining for somebody who's maybe struggling to keep things together on a daily basis. Anyway, let's ask. We've been hogging the discussion, and that's a little bit rude. I'm sorry. So it's time to ask if there's anybody in the audience who has a question, or if we can make them quick as well, that would be great. So that was yours was the first hand to go up on the basis of speed. No, the lady behind. On the basis of speed.
Hello, thank you for the panel. I, as a Russian journalist, reported on the so-called troll factories, which I guess you all knew. And unfortunately, this topic wasn't touched upon at this panel. And I would really like to know if there is, I do not expect a magic recipe, but at least some advice. How do you handle massive attacks, like flash mob-like attacks, which are not done by bots, unfortunately?
Okay.
Thank you.
So maybe Michelle first?
Yes, there are operatives that are botnets, and there are operatives that are real people that are behind these types of activities. And as I said, some of what they're doing is very purposeful, and it's a strategy, and so they don't fear any recourse. And unfortunately, the platforms like Twitter and others have profited from the pain of the individuals who happen to be on the receiving end of that. And so I think while Twitter has shut down some of the egg activity on their platform, they've still left behind many people who continue to respawn identities and use those to evil purposes. And so one of the things that we're attempting to do is work with people like Twitter and Facebook to help them understand that there are no legal consequences to this behavior, and so people operate with impunity. And if they are not willing to moderate their own platform to provide the civil space for conversation, then I think we as journalists have to decide whether or not that's a platform we choose to operate on, and make it a consequence. Also, one of the things that I think we could do, particularly in the United States, is that the free press is part of our Constitution and is the only protected profession in our Constitution. And I think that Twitter as well might offer alternative avenues for journalists to have their information checked and protections in place for them. So right now, everybody has to go through the same gate as young people who are being attacked, as everybody who's being attacked. But just as they have verified accounts for celebrities and journalists and now have opened that up, if they had an alternate channel where journalists had a more direct connection to people who might be able to help, especially with these kinds of swarm attacks, where we can get at it quicker, faster, and shut down some of that activity, I think that would be a wonderful solution.
Great, thanks. Greg, they're pretty sophisticated, these guys.
They can be. My response to that question would be what she said plus Facebook.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Twitter and Facebook.
That if Facebook and Twitter want journalists, want news organizations to be a part of what they're doing, step up your game as far as protections go. And I think that's certainly if any organization can take on the botnets and try to manage that kind of flow of hate and abuse, it's these large tech companies that have the resources to be able to put in place a technological response. So they should.
Great. So you have a question. Is it following straight on from this? Yeah, please, the microphone. Yeah.
Corriere della Sera. We are working on these on two sides. One with a friend and a colleague who works for the Washington Post, Anne Applebaum. We're working with the London School of Economics. We're studying it, and many organizations. We're working Italy and the UK to see what we can do. And two or three things. Number one, we are convinced that in some countries, at least in the European Union, we can do more from the legal point of view. I think even us, journalists, we have not really come to terms, we haven't come to terms with the fact that now online is just another part of life and people behave online in a way that is not acceptable outside, and sometimes we do. I've been on Twitter for many years, I have quite a lot of followers, and I am used to being insulted, attacked, I don't care, but I think when it happens to younger journalists, 20 years ago, it would be different. Now, that's one. So I think legally. Number two, I think the Russian colleague said something interesting. Anne Applebaum was one of the first to bring up and realize, because it happened to her and to her husband, who was a Polish minister, that in Russia it was a systematic attack. Years ago she realized. So one thing when countries are involved, and it happened in Russia, so you can do something if you have in Germany or in Italy, if you have someone legally, I think we should do more. Of course, Twitter should do much more. And we know all. Number two. And three, and so it's what we're doing at Corriere now. Actually, my colleague here, she's working on it. She's been working on it for a couple of months next to me. And we are meeting them. We're trying to, and we are actually some of the worst people. We managed to go and talk to them, and I can tell you what we found out is pretty extraordinary. I mean, you have everything. You have the real psychopath, and you have people that are, in a way, in need of help. Let's put it this way. So I think we have no solution, but I think it's something that we have to work hard. It's spoiling we cancel comments in Corriere della Sera. It's impossible to manage. Yeah. It's too expensive and all that. Great. So three different things.
Thank you very much for that. So I think so I need to speak a bit about my shop, the Dart Centre. So we're very interested in working with psychologists and trying to understand things. And one of the things you have when you're threatened and you can't see the threat is the threat tends to expand and increase. So the troll becomes a bigger and bigger creature in one's imagination. And I think it's an important part of this is trying to understand who the trolls are. There's a very nice little film called Internet Warriors, which is on the Guardian website, and it's on the cover now, so if you get there quickly, you can find it. It's about 15 minutes, and this filmmaker goes and he interviews trolls, and they're full of hate, and they're saying terrible, terrible things. And you see the context of their life, which is often quite miserable and quite sad, and they're lonely people. And what it does is it sort of pops the bubble a little bit, and they become kind of smaller and understandable. And I think one of the difficulties that we have as journalists is we're very, very easy to hook because we have this amazing toolkit which is all about having discussion, finding out the truth, understanding how the world works. And so we get engaged with the trolls in the wrong way. So we become locked in an argument in which we're trying to say, well, it's not just like this, you don't quite understand, the picture is bigger, and they're effectively saying, shut up, bitch, because they don't want to have an argument, they don't want to have a discussion. And this has got this incivility and this kind of lashing out is pretty widespread. And I think one of the things that we need to ask as a profession is, why do we turn our toolbox against ourselves? So we have like a great argument, we explain something, and then somebody says, no, that's wrong, because you're missing this. And there's sometimes it's good to engage with that and we can learn. But if the person's not interested in a real discussion, we sit there thinking, oh, well, maybe they're right. Maybe I should have talked about this. And maybe I am in the pay of the communists, or maybe I am a fascist, or maybe I'm a monarchist, or whatever it is. And before we know it, we kind of go down this process of destabling ourselves. So I think we need to think a little bit about thinking tools as well. And one of the things at the Dart Centre we're looking at is individual styles of relating. So everybody, when they're in a crisis situation or they're affected by something, will have their own way of dealing with it. And there are some people who like to ruminate. So ruminate means that you think again and again and again about the stuff that you've been dealing with. And that's great if you share it and get rid of it. But it's not so great as a thinking style if you're replaying the bad thing that happened the whole time. And so some kind of basic psychoeducation about, you know, if you find yourself ruminating, talk to somebody you trust. Are you blowing this out of proportion? What would it be like if you thought your troll, you know, if you thought maybe your troll wasn't really such a scary person, was maybe an inadequate person? Now, that approach won't work if they're really dangerous people, and that's something we haven't talked about. But what if the threats are real? And that's a time in which you have to involve kind of security people. Anyway, let's have one more kind of question there. You've been very patient.
Thank you. So some of the trolls are anonymous, and then you have people that use social media with their face in their name to direct the crowds towards trolling certain people. And Twitter has banned people like Milo from using the platform. But at the same time, you have someone like the President of the United States using his Twitter account often to attack others, attack news organizations. So what hope do we have to change that kind of online culture when it comes from such a high place of authority? Should Twitter ban Donald Trump?
All right, well, there's a reason why I call him the troll-in-chief. Because he has set a tone from the highest office in our country that has made journalists fair game. And that has created a ripple effect through our journalism where we're now chasing fake news and other things instead of looking at the larger issue of what's happening here, which is a manipulation of people's thoughts and realities in order to be able to control them. And so I think as journalists, instead of engaging with him as we have in the past on Twitter or trying to fact check him when he's going to continue to reiterate whatever lies he chooses to tweet out, that we have to understand that there's a different way that we need to operate with our communities and building trust in a way that we break down the ability to penetrate the truth that we're trying to put out. And so that involves, unfortunately, some hard work at legacy media, mainstream media organizations to engage with their communities beyond online platforms physically, so that people put names and faces and humans to the activity that's happening, and build their own resources rather than engaging the troll.
So quickly, Barbara, what's happening in Germany? Are the politicians behaving themselves? Are they part of the solution or part of the problem?
Oh, compared to Trump?
Yes. Yes, they're part of the...
Is that the measure? I don't know. No, but I think, honestly, that this has set a tone, but we had a debate about the Lügenpresse or Pinocchio press before we had the American election, and there's something which has been set, a debate which has been set by the rightist populist parties, obviously, who try to undermine the trustworthiness of the press in order to seek advantage by themselves. And the tone is getting more and more rude, and we get the impression that that has been reflected by the public as well, because it's not only the trolls, but it's people emailing you and telling you you should die, and they are not reluctant at all to put their whole signature underneath those emails. And this is something I hadn't experienced about 5 years ago, that engineers do email you, or whole families email you, and you have the whole postal address, and you could even email them back, and that doesn't mean to stop the conversation, or you won't recognize any feelings of resentment or shame or something like that, but people tend to say that it's okay to say such things because the press is lying, and that is basically what you just said, that it's reflecting what is going on in politics. Yeah, I think politics set the tone.
So it's like a huge problem, and one that we have to approach from hundreds of angles. We've only got, I think, time really for one question probably, and if you still have a question, yes, sorry for ignoring you. Microphone?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, is the method of harassment that you see for women journalists similar to the kind of attacks you see for other communities, minorities, LGBTI communities, or are the methods slightly different? Are the attacks different? Are the remedies different?
My understanding, I'm going to ask the panelists, is that it depends very much on the story. So the first weapon that would be used against people working on minority stories would be, for instance, pictures of lynchings sent to people who are reporting on criminal justice stories. And if it's gender-based, then the mechanism is rape. Or the thing they're referring to, the question partly is, are those people kind of fanboys who are swarming together? Or if the story is more political, are they, people who are kind of sort of trained, operatives who are doing that? It's a more complicated thing. But Michelle, you probably have a wide range of delightful things you've seen.
I think, as I said, I think for women and minorities and LGBTQ, it is about identity first, and then content second. And that journalists who do then cover topics like politics, like refugees and other different types of issues that also are inflammatory, that's a secondary effect. But what I think we've seen is primarily it has to do with the identity of the person and the platform that they have to be able to speak.
Great. I think, what do you say? You have the power. Very last question. Very, very last question. Please, you have to make it short, otherwise we'll ruin the organizer's day.
I'll be short. Just as an editor, what would you recommend my reaction will be if I witness somebody in my newsroom that is being attacked, that is being harassed? Because I've been in this situation before. I'm not sure my reaction was correct. What would be the good words to use? What would be really helpful in that sort of situation?
You mean just in terms of having a conversation? I think listening is the first thing, and whatever you do, don't minimize the experience, or don't say something like, you think that's bad? You should see what Eric got last week, that kind of thing. And we might fall into those traps because we want to make it better, make him or her not worry. But just listen, and then constructively problem solve. So then ask them, were there particular aspects of this that you found upsetting, and what were they? And then you might get to the thing about, well, they sent me a picture of a dead child, and I have a child, or whatever it is that's particularly concerning. And then say, acknowledge this is really tough, and then say, well, what do you think we should? Do you have any suggestions for what you'd like to do? How are we going to manage this? So you involve them collaboratively in the process. And if it's a legal thing, back them up, obviously. And I would tell people, though, that it's not unusual to feel jittery, and when you're threatened, this is what I'd say to somebody who was threatened with a knife or a gun, is that, you might find this, difficult for a few weeks, you might find it difficult to concentrate. Let's keep talking about it, reviewing the situation. I'll tell you, we'll do all we can. One thing I think Michelle talked about very eloquently when we were chatting about this earlier was the idea that be a bit careful that you don't imply that it was probably something that they wrote that may have caused it. Like, well, if you put that kind of thing in the story, what do you expect? Which is, I'm saying this on Michelle's behalf, so you'll have to forgive me as it's a bit quicker. But Michelle was talking about the situation. It's if somebody's sexually harassed or raped, you don't ask them, well, what were you wearing? So be careful about that. That, I'm afraid, is your time up. It's all over. It's only an hour, but we can carry on talking outside. So find us and chat with us and check out the various tools. Check out the Coral Project. Look at Spiegel Online. Look at Trollbusters. Look at the Dart Centre website and try and see if there's stuff on it that's useful for all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, so hello everybody. Welcome to this discussion on a really increasingly important topic, which is online harassment and various kinds of threats, intimidation, abuse, uncivil behavior that seems to be coming at journalists from all angles. I know there have been other sessions today on this topic, and so we may cover some similar ground, but it's such an important topic. I'm really glad that the festival is giving it lots of coverage. First of all, I'm going to introduce the panel, and then we'll kind of try and make this as an open discussion as possible. So I'll take questions at various times. My name is Gavin Rees, and I work for the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma. And we're an organisation that's like a network of concerned professionals, journalists, psychologists, and trauma experts who are interested in understanding how we can make better, more insightful and accurate and interesting and relevant reporting on violence. And sometimes we're talking to people about issues around interviewing, other times we're talking about self-care, and we're also talking about how we engage with audiences. If you may have seen this is a kind of freebie to take away. It's a guide on how to handle traumatic imagery that comes into the newsroom. I'm giving it to you now precisely because we haven't really got time to talk about this as a subtopic, so you can go away and read that. So let me introduce my panel. On my left, I have Greg Barber, who's head of digital news at the Washington Post, and has been working on a very exciting project, the Coral Project, which is looking at issues of the kind of new rules and procedures for audience engagement in this shifting online world that we don't really understand very carefully, very well yet. And on my right is Michelle Ferrier, who is the founder. I'm almost inclined to say that she's kind of Buffy the Vampire Slayer of the online media world, because the organization she runs is called Trollbusters. And as part of this conversation, we're going to have a little kind of, I don't know what the word would be, ethological, like a kind of wildlife program discussion of the various habits of trolls and what they do and what they're like and how we can confront them. She's also an associate professor at Scripps College of Journalism, is that right?
Scripps School of Journalism.
Scripps School of Journalism, I'm corrected, at Ohio University. And at the end of the table, we have Barbara Hans, who's editor-in-chief of Spiegel Online, and a long-time friend and associate of the Dart Center. I think we met in about 2010 when you came and did an academic fellowship. Barbara's very interested in student engagement as well and designed a really interesting trauma and journalism course for students. So, online harassment. The days used to be that we saw ourselves, I don't know what the word would be, but kind of hard-boiled and hard-bitten. And the idea was that if people in the public sent in threatening letters, then they were just kind of isolated cranks, and water should flow off a duck's back, and sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt, etc., etc., etc. But we seem to have gone through a game change now, when the abuse is coming from all directions. Some of it's mechanized, some of it's organized by states. Other uncivility appears to be springing up naturally in the ether. We were hoping for an age of engagement online, and instead we seem to be confronted with an age of anger. So before we go into a kind of more of a conversation mode, I'm going to ask Michelle to just give us a kind of sort of brief where we are now type picture.
Sure. I wanted to share a little bit about what we look at, particularly in the U.S., around online harassment, and hope that some of this might translate as well to the experiences that I've heard from other journalists from around the world as I've been working on this issue for the past few years. And so I wanted to define this term, particularly in the literature and the scholarship that looks at online harassment. It's an intentional and overt act of aggression, which involves making rude or nasty comments, etc. And that's important for the literature, but that doesn't really define how this operates when it comes into the legal environment. So I think there's some differences in how we look at it as scholars and how it's operationalized when we come to creating solutions around this space. To describe a little bit about what we've been seeing over the past several years in this space, in the U.S. particularly, the Pew Research Center, who does research work on media and the populace, found that 4 in 10 users in general are experiencing online harassment in these days, and that this harassment has become more severe. And this was a study done in 2014, and I'm sure if the results were done today, we'd find a very different result. Specifically on Twitter, which is the platform that I primarily work on, we have a study that was done that looked at the many faces of hate speech and harassment on Twitter. And you can see at the top, while there's a prevalence of hate speech, we see other activities that are also happening on this platform that are racist, homophobic, that are putting out personal information of women and journalists in this space in a way that intimidates and provides an environment of fear. The International News Safety Institute has also done some work, particularly looking at both the physical as well as the online presence of harassment. And they discovered that journalists themselves feel that their work is much more dangerous than it has been in the past, and primarily pointing to the role of social media and the ways in which they've used that in their work. I think you might be familiar with the example of this journalist here who was here in Italy and was trying to put out some very innocuous information, I believe, about putting a woman on the money in the country, and received some threats from other places on the right here, and then some other threats that we see. So while some of the harassment is about